had a request from one of you to continue and do another watercolour film, but this time slightly shorter. Most of my films are very intense and there's a lot in them. I don't make very short ones because most of you in the past have preferred and asked for the longer films with more detail and more going on. Obviously as well, if I'm taking you through a whole painting, unless I do the fast motion, we're going to have a fairly long film to get it all in. I've got 3 works lined up. I've got this one, which I want to do very, very loosely. I really do need to get much looser and explore and slap around the materials a bit more, work very loosely in this one. And then I've got this watercolour as well, which I'm going to do. I was going to do it as a pastel and water, that's why I've used the hot press paper, but in fact I might have a different composition to do for that one. I'll do this as a slightly finer watercolour, and by request from one of you, you've just asked me to do another smaller watercolour demonstration exploring glazes and washes a bit more, but in this case and possibly a little easier for those of you who haven't got much time. So what I'll do in that one is I'll do the demonstration of some of the basics of watercolour just to get you started, and then I'll continue into the film making it a longer one still, showing this one being done in a very fine and delicate way using many of those methods, not quite so loosely this time. And that means that once you've seen the basics you can go away and just leave the film and continue, or you can continue on and see the rest, or you can come back to it later. That way all of you are happy, aren't you? You'll have the shorter version with the basics and we'll have the version going into more detail. Then after that, another more major one in the Secret series, this one, which I'm really looking forward to as well, this York scene and a wet rainy day, which should be a lovely one to do with the rollers, so I'm going to work a lot more into the rollers. The first one I showed you I want to work much more loosely with brushes, splattering and all sorts of different scrapings and techniques. This one now I'm going back to where we started with the rollers and the brushes, and getting this feeling of reflections and loose and abstract as well as figurative work going on in the same picture. And hope you will enjoy these as much as many of you have the rest. Okay then, for this basic demonstration on all about watercolours, just the basics of watercolours, because I've gone into far more detail in my other films, you can look into those. I'll take a few bits from the other films to add to this to save myself time in demonstrating the whole thing over again. What I'm going to do then is start from the very beginning of what is watercolour, what is the medium itself, how is it used, paper, what papers are we going to use on different papers, how do we stretch those papers out, how do we prepare the surfaces, and then how do we actually use these various watercolours. Just the very basics. And then as I say, at the end we'll go into finishing a watercolour for you and with you. Now watercolours themselves, what are they? Well, they're pigment, that's coloured powder, that is mixed with gum arabic, a liquid that is water soluble, and when that dries it holds them together into blocks. I buy mine as tubes like this, and then I add them to a palette later, and they will dry out just the same as these ones, or we can use them liquid. You need to damp them first of all before you can use them, and then they'll be usable straight away. These are full pans, in other words they are the larger blocks. You can buy the blocks separately to go into the pans, you can buy the tins to put them into even without paints in. If they're smaller than this, half this size, they're called half pans. You do need to buy artist quality watercolours. It's not a saving to buy the very cheap ones because they aren't as transparent, they aren't as good, they won't do the same things. So although you might think they're cheaper and they're a saving, if you buy the slightly more expensive artist quality, they will go longer, so you'll get twice the amount out of the paints anyway. It's not a saving. So there's your basics just on paints. So what happens when you use water with them? What I'm going to do first of all is just take a small round brush. I'm going to go into brushes and papers and all these other things differently. There is no way to do this at high speed. All I can do is show you some basics now, because there is just so much to watercolour that you'll need to learn. So I take a brush and I'm going to wet some of my yellow paint just a little bit, so it's solid at the moment, wet the surface, and then if I come down to my paper, immediately I can paint a mark. Now with watercolour we're painting onto a light surface, nearly always painting onto a white paper. It doesn't have to be, but we need the lightness of the paper to make our colours, to help our colours to give transparency. Watercolour is a transparent medium, but some colours are more transparent than others. So if I take that paint and paint it thinly, you can see this is called a wash. If I take a little bit more pigment into the brush, I can make it a bit stronger. Now I can make this wash as strong as I like by adding more and more paint in, and it's the white of the paper that makes it lighter. So if I want a cream, I'm using the paint thinner because white and yellow makes cream. If I want a stronger yellow, then I paint the yellow more strongly. If I paint the paint onto dry paper, I get a sharp dry line. If I paint it back into the wet, it goes softer. Now let's just discuss this business of it being a pigment. Here is a pastel, and I'm going to just break a little bit of that pastel off, and I'm going to sprinkle it onto the paper. Now I've broken that down. I'm now going to add some water to it, and look, it works just the same as the watercolour, but now possibly you can see that the pastel is more opaque. The watercolour is transparent, and some watercolours are more transparent than others. Let's bring this into the watercolour so we can mix a medium, but look how transparent that is compared to that. In the same way, I can use the pastel as a drawing instrument to draw with it, and then I can work the watercolour afterwards, and you can see I can thin it out to make it more transparent afterwards. So basically pastel is pure pigment bound together with a little gum arabic, and then we can use it in a more opaque way because it's a coarser pigment than the finer watercolour, which is the finest pigment of all. And most of the paints that you get, acrylics and poster colours and so on, are the same sort of coarseness as the pastels. They're not going to be transparent. Watercolour is transparent, and that's why you want the artist watercolours. So there's my reasoning towards watercolour. You're painting on white paper, you're painting on the lights first and gradually going darker and darker. With the opaque paints, you're painting on, you're able to paint lights over darks. You can't really do that as much as watercolours. There are some exceptions, but we have to put an opaque base medium over a colour. So if I wanted to paint over a watercolour, I would have to use something like white gouache or white acrylic or pastel over the top to make lighter colours. We have to leave our lights behind. So in other words, if I want a fluffy cloud, I've got to leave a fluffy white area like that in between. And we can make that softer and use different techniques shortly to make that look as if it's furry and so on, like that, by just blending it in. Okay, very basics of what the paint is. So it's pigment bound together with gum arabic. And we're going to use watercolour paper, the white paper in this case, although you can get tinted, to give a white background, and we're making our lights and darks by going thinner with the paint or thicker with the paint. Right, if we continue with this talk about watercolours, that was a basic wash. Now over a wash we can put a glaze. Now watercolour, when it's actually on, will be fixed. The gum arabic will dry and it won't come off on your fingers and it won't smudge. Pastel, when you put water with it, is also fairly well fixed, but there's a little bit of smudging, look. It's coming away just that little bit when I've got a lot of pastel there. But if we use pastel with water, it will be fixed, and we can put succeeding coats of pastel over it, different technique altogether, different video altogether. Let's take some more of that same colour, and we're now going to go from washes to what we call glazes. Now a glaze can either be the same colour over it or a different colour over it. And a glaze is the same thing, a wash, but a wash over the top of another pre-existing dry glaze. So if I go over this, you see it becomes darker. If I put a little bit more pigment into it, it's darker still. If I were to take some red, and it's a transparent colour, if I put it on as a wash, there we are, there's the first wash, and you'll notice as I bring this wash over the red, we get orange, because red and yellow makes orange. So although I could have made an orange, I can make different oranges also by glazing over the top. And depending how thickly I make that glaze, as to how light the orange is, whether it goes lighter or darker. And of course different reds will give different oranges over different yellows. So here's a nice bright red over that. If I thin it right down, going to wet next to wet here and bring it in, then we'll see we get a different effect again. So we can get our colours by making them lighter and putting them on thinly, so we get a pink. We can make them thicker, darker and stronger by putting a glaze over, which is a wash over an existing dry glaze. So there's our basics of a wash and a glaze. Now let's just see what we can do with washes and how many washes we can actually do. So now you're understanding what watercolour paint is and how it works, how it's transparent, and how some colours are more opaque than others. Okay, now we just start to touch on how paint behaves when it's wet and when it's dry. If I take a bit of purple, I'm going to use this to go against that red, and then we come into colour hues, the warm and cools of each colour. If I go dark there, I'm going to use this in a minute and let it dry to deliberately put light over dark with an opaque watercolour. See how it spreads in here, how we can get the effects of wet next to wet or wet into wet. If I spread that there and do a larger amount, it's going to spread outwards, and the wetter the paper, the wetter that's going to, the further that's going to spread, giving me lovely furry effects. We're going to use that later. So with wet next to wet and wet into wet, we're going to let that dry just to show you how we can use an opaque colour over a transparent colour, or what happens when we use the same colour but transparent colour over the dark colour as well. So both ways. So now you're seeing the brightness of these colours used transparently, and how we can use light next to dark, warm next to cool. And again, a lot more to go on to, a lot more in depth in my films, but just the basics of watercolour. Useful tool to have amongst your brushes and everything else. Watercolour is a simple hairdryer. The reason being that we can go straight to whether we're just painted and dry it off quick. There we go then. Let's zoom back in on that and see what else I can show you there. Right, let's look at this business of transparent paint then, shall we? I'm going to take a bit of aureolin yellow now, which is a very transparent yellow. Just mix it there. And if I try painting that across these darker colours, you'll see it hardly makes a difference. It just makes a very slight tint. So however strong it is there, I'll put it down here for you. You can see there, it's a nice transparent light yellow over the white paper. But if I try to bring that aureolin yellow across here, we don't really see it. Now if I go and take some lemon yellow, which is an opaque yellow of almost exactly the same colour, so here it is next to that one, almost the same, but this one is opaque, and see how it will show over the dark. There we go. Quick demonstration of opaque colour there and transparent colour. Now just now we painted wet into wet and wet next to wet, and we've got those lovely effects. This is now dry. If I wet this again and I drop in a colour over that, we can still put wet over the paint, but it's now wet into clean water over it. Look at the lovely effects we can get that way too. So I'll just spread that in. We'll see how we can get the wet into wet effect, a bit of purple now. In the same way, but just by spreading it into clear water. So we've put wet into wet or wet next to wet on next to each other and into each other. We've let them dry, and now I put some water on and I've dropped in over the top. So it's almost like glazing, but it's wet into wet. If I glaze again, here we are, that same purple over the yellow. So you've got all these variations of things going on. Now our next thing, we can lift out. If I go back to that with the same brush, dry the brush out with my fingers or use a bit of tissue, I can suck the paint back out again. I can drag this across here and try to get back almost to the paper itself. Look how I can start lifting that dark colour out back here. I can start lifting it out with a dry brush or a damp brush. And I can bring that colour back, look, all the way through there by just rubbing and lifting it out. Now there's a thing called magic sponges. You can use those as well. They're quite good for lifting out. And a very useful tool to have, a material to have amongst your stuff, is simple toilet paper. So if I take an area here and wet that, I can lift it out with the tissue paper, the toilet paper as well. We're going to do that in skies shortly. All I'm doing is showing you some of the basic techniques of watercolour so you can see just how it's going to work when we actually start doing it. I'm going to do individual little lessons on different scenes to show you how all of these come together. Right, so now you understand a bit about what the paint is and how the basic of it works. Let's go to the next stage of, we'll go back to the washes, but I'm going to make a graduated wash and a variegated wash before we go on to glazes over those. Of course we also have to learn all about our different brushes, but again we're going to do that as we go on. This is a round I was using. I'm now going to go to a mop brush for doing my washes. This is a mop brush. It's narrow one way and flat the other. You can get round mops as well. This is an oval mop. The first thing I'm going to look at is a graduated wash. So what I'm going to do here is take some ultramarine. I'm going to start it fairly strong and just bring it downwards in my paper here. From there, quite strong. Now I could do this by painting it into wet paper. I'm going to bring it down from there, and then I'm going to gradually make it lighter and lighter by adding more water. So here's one way, then we bring it all the way down. Look, and it's a graduated wash from stronger to lighter. Now I can make that stronger by adding more paint to it at the top if I want, like this. And if we tilt the paper, which is a very useful thing to do, you'll see it actually starting to trickle down the paper, and we can use that to great effect. The other thing is I've used ultramarine deliberately because you see a granulation going on here. If we look closely, it's granulated, it's become blotchy. Some colours do that, some colours don't. And that's one of the beautiful things about ultramarine, is it does do it. Whatever it's mixed with, it does it as well. So that was a graduated from darker to light. Again, if I take my tissue, as I used just now, imagine this is a sky, I can dab this in to now make clouds. So I can take it out with the tissue, or I can take it out with exactly the same brush by drying the brush and lifting out the paint. So straight away you see how we can make lighter colours. Now let's look at a variegated wash. I'm going to take a bit of turquoise this time, and some ultramarine. And I'm going to come down through the two. I could come from the dark to the light. In this case I'm just going to show you how versatile it is. I'm going to go with the light on there and thin it down. I'm going to take my same ultramarine again and come down to that, so variegated from the warmer, darker blue into the lighter one, and we get a variegated wash. Again, if I tilt it, it will level out. And if I want to take clouds out of that, I can go back in either with the tissue or the brush to take the clouds out by lifting out. Equally, I could have painted it around the clouds. I'll show you that. Okay, I've dried those off. Now, we've talked about wet into wet, wet next to wet. When it's wet into wet or wet next to wet, we get soft edges. If we paint wet over dry, we get hard edges. So if I take some nice deep purple again, mix it in with some of that grey I was doing earlier to make a very dark blue. If I now paint this colour over this, this is dry here now, I can go, oops, look, and it's still fairly transparent, and I can make a tree by just painting outwards. So this is wet over dry, and you can see we get a sharp edge. If I want to soften something, I can come back with the same brush, and I can soften an edge by simply wetting it and rubbing it in, by blending it in. So we can still come back to our paints and lift out or blend them together softly. So now you see the basics of watercolour, and we've got the wet and the dry, and we've got the wet into wet, the wet next to wet. Then we've got the wet over the dry giving a hard edge. So if we do that, we can have cool next to warm, light next to dark, and rough next to smooth. And that will give us texture. It will make the sky, for instance, much more textural. Let's deliberately do that for fun. Take a little bit of green, and if I'm not going to use a textural brush for this, I'm just going to use this brush, but if I start to do this, look how smooth the sky appears next to this, because this is rougher. So it makes other things next to it. So we're playing with those opposites, aren't we? Now there are several ways to make our whites. We've shown how we can leave them behind on the white paper. We could use something called masking fluid, and I'm going to discuss as we go along, which leaves a rubber solution on the paper which we can rub off afterwards. Or we can come back in with white paint. So for instance, with these clouds here, I've got some white paint on my brush. It can either be gouache or acrylic. In this case it's acrylic. But I can paint white paint back over the darks if I want to. It isn't so pure and bright as it would be with just painting with leaving the white paper. But if you want to do highlights, it can be quite useful. So in water, for instance, we could dry brush across there just by dragging this through, look, and leaving the effects of the colour, of the sparkle just showing through. So you can see how we can use the brush in a different way over the surface of the texture of the paper, and we're going to go into papers in just a moment as well. That's the basics of watercolour. We've talked about how we use the light of the paper to make the lighter colours, and how we use transparent colours by washes and glazes. Before I go on to what the actual papers, what I want to do is just to show you what happens when we tilt the paper a bit more. We just showed that a moment ago to a degree. Let's just take the same thing, a variegated wash with the graduated working through it. We'll have a few clouds at the top here, just coming down through and into here, right down through to here. Very, very strong with the colour up at the top. and I'm going to go even stronger just around the outside of these clouds, really dark to bring out the whites of the clouds. Then I'm going to come down with my blue that I was using earlier, the turquoise, just come underneath these, a little bit underneath these clouds here too, and we get that lovely immediacy of a fluffy sky. And just let the water flow in, clean water here. And what happens if I to go a little bit higher up and actually put some clean water here for the clouds and letting it just touch underneath, look, so we get that swirling in of the clouds up here. And then I take the same thing again, the blue, and just go around the clean water. And where there's a hard dry edge, we get a sharp edge, and where it isn't, we're getting this lovely swirling effect. So you can see now the difference between all three of those. We're going to do a sky in a moment, but I said I want to run through materials and brushes first. Right up to here, and I'm going to add a little bit more purple to it, just make it a bit warmer as the sky comes up here, and bring those colours down into here, into the wet. But now you can see where it's wet next to dry. And darker still, let's really find these shapes before I come in and want to do a storm through here, which I want to do in just a moment. Right, we're able to lift out when we want, so I'll come back with a brush and I'm going to lift out some of these clouds in the background here. Softer at the bottom there, we've got hard and soft edges now, right through to here. Can lift out some of these up here. Now, I haven't tilted that yet, but if I tilt that paper now, you'll see how the paint trickles down. See it coming down here. And if I want to make the effect of rain, for instance, of a shower of rain coming through here, or storm coming through here, let's just do just that. I'm going to make a very dark cloud coming in there now, so I'm going to take some Prussian blue and some brown, deliberately put a little bit of red into there, just to give a really dark grey. And I'm going to drop in this really dark cloud here, even darker still. I want it really, really dark for this. A bit more purple into it. And I'm going to tilt it for the rain to come down, but not just straight down. There we go. I'm not going to do it just straight down. I'm actually going to do this at a very slight angle in a moment, so we get the rain trickling like that, look. And we'll let that come on down through there. Right, you've seen how that now can trickle in that way. Let's put a bit of water down the bottom here and let it deliberately trickle into the clean water. Just to give you techniques, so clean water right through here now. I'm going to let that trickle down at an angle through there. So we get this lovely furry effect coming down through that sky. So we've got wet next to dry there, wet next to wet here, wet into wet here, but clean water along here for these clouds to come right down into. We can control them to a degree. Look, we can tilt it whenever we want to make it go any direction. So there we've got that lovely effect of the storm cloud coming down through the sky. By tilting the paper, we can tilt that in any direction. I could go on later and I could tilt it the other way if I want to do it. Now let's just say we've got light here that's coming down through here. I showed you just now how to lift out. So let's just lift out some of this light coming down through here with the brush. Like this, look, rays of sunlight coming down. Take a bit of tissue, so I've done it with the brush once. Do it with the brush again now, just clean it out and lift out. You can get rays of light coming down, or I can take my tissue, take a bit of clean tissue again, and I can lift out these rays of light coming down. You can even use a cotton wool bud if you wanted. We get the effect of rays of light just shining through here. From this area up here, we can lift out there as well a little bit, look. Get this effect, wonderful effects of the light. So there we are. You begin to see what watercolour can do. Right, from now on I'm going to now discuss some of the papers, how you stretch the papers, what we use, why we use them, and the objects that we're going to use to paint. Then I'm going to go on to doing a whole series of different paintings, a whole series of small demonstrations showing how we're going to use those effects. We're going to do the skies here. We're going to do how we get mist between valleys and the skies, how we have foreground, middle distance, distance, how we can get lifting out going on there with the mist coming down over the mountains and using the white paint, the effects of light against dark, how we can use the white acrylic if we want to. I'm going to do that. And to also go on then to reflections and how I can get soft and smooth reflections, how the sharp against the smooth, so we've got cool against warm, light against dark and sharp against smooth to get the effects of things, how we're going to use different colour sequences, how we can get the different colour effects. We're gradually working up from light to dark, how we're going to use different brushes and sponges and textures to get our leaves and so on. Then we're going to look at the bleeding and the blending, as we were doing just now. We looked at how to paint wet next to wet and wet into wet, and lights and darks again, and effects of glazing on those. Finally, I want to go on to trees, and we'll just look at the way we can paint various trees with the brush techniques and with sponges and so on. So that will give you a basic, first of all now, of what watercolour is about, what we've just been doing down here, and how we do it. And at that stage you can finish and go and do your own if you want, or you can continue watching and see me do demonstrations of each, and then finally at the very end I'm going to do a complete painting of a street scene. Okay, the next thing I want to talk to you about are watercolour papers. And I can tell you a lot about papers in themselves, but we want to keep this video fairly simple, so I'm just going to deal with the watercolour papers. Now, watercolour papers are made by different companies, and each company produces a very different sort of paper. So the way papers are made, paper pulp itself has been bleached, and when it's pressed and dried, it's given a coat of glue size. And this is just on the surface of the paper, and it's very important because each different make puts a certain different amount of glue size on, so the papers behave differently. The glue size resists the water, it makes it less soakable, makes it less like blotting paper. And I can assure you that if you've ever made homemade paper and tried it without, it just soaks the paint straight in and it's very difficult to work with. So the glue size and different makes are very important. So you have to experiment with different types of papers to find out how they react to your paint, what you like most and the way they work best for you. Now going on from there then, we've got three surfaces of paper. As you see here, we've got the rough paper and then the medium in between, which is called knot, and then we've got the smoothest paper. So we've got rough, and we can have an extra rough of the rough, and then we've got the knot, and then we've got the smooth, which is very smooth. Not only do we have different surfaces of paper like these, but we also have different weights of paper. If you have 140 GSM, then it's going to be quite a light paper, it's medium, it may need stretching. If you've got a 300 GSM, it's going to be very heavy, almost like cardboard, and it doesn't always need stretching. Stretching we're going to go into again shortly, but that's the basics of your different papers. Most of the papers supplied are white, but you can get them in creams and various other colours as well. You only need to look at buying a white paper. So we want to keep it simple. I'm going to go into colours and other things in a moment, and again I'll keep those simple and just give you the basics to start off as a beginning with. Now the watercolour papers come in large sheets or smaller sheets or even pads, and in the pads it's quite good because they're actually glued together at the edges, so you don't have to stretch the paper, it's already glued down at the edges, and it's only when you finish that you can peel it away. So buying a watercolour pad is possibly your better way of starting. Otherwise you need to take the paper down if it's a lighter paper. Usually ordinary masking tape will do that, but sometimes, and you'll see me doing it here, we like to use gum tape. Now using gum tape, again I'll put a little bit of video on about that, but be careful how you use it. When you stretch paper with using gum tape, you have to wet the paper and you have to have the gum tape prepared beforehand. The idea of wetting the paper is, and both sides of the paper, the idea of wetting both sides of the paper is that it expands the paper as it would when you paint. And when it expands, it cockles and it comes outwards, you lay it onto your board, then you put the gum tape around it, and when it dries out, it stretches back again, it shrinks back again. So when you paint, the effect isn't as great, it doesn't cockle as badly, and if it does, it goes back into place. As I say, for a heavier paper like a 300 you won't need to do it, but with a lighter paper you might. With the watercolour pads you don't, because they're already glued at the edges. So the trick then, a smaller piece of paper or a heavier piece of paper, you can just put ordinary masking tape around. With a lighter piece of paper that's larger, you might want to stretch it. The trick to that, make sure you've got the right size board, make sure it's a good sturdy board that won't bend or warp with the pressure of the paper against it. Prepare the paper ready, prepare your gum tape ready with dry hands. If you touch a reel of gum tape even with a wet thumb, later the whole thing is destroyed because it glues at the edges and keeps tearing away. So prepare the lengths of tape ready, put them to one side, wet the paper both sides twice under a tap or a shower, lay it onto your board, leave it a few minutes, it will cockle, lift it, then put it down again, then wet your gum tape and put it all the way around. Don't stretch it in front of artificial heat. It can tighten up so much like a drum that it can actually tear and split across. Just let it dry naturally overnight and then you're ready to paint. So that's the basics of paper. You've now seen the surfaces. Now, why do you have different surfaces? If you want to do a very fine picture, then the smooth or the hot pressed is a great paper to work on. It's also very nice for pastel as well. If you want a more textural scene like snow, grasses and so on, where you just want to do dry brushwork and so on, then you go rougher and rougher, and the rougher the paper, the more texture you're going to get. And the stiffer the brush, the more texture you're going to go across that surface of that paper, and the softer the brush, the more it's going to go into the paper. But again, we're going to deal with brushes later as well. So anyway, there's the basics of your paper. We'll move on now to the colours. I've already shown you my palette of colours and how I work with them. You can buy them as little sets with a limited amount of colours, or you can buy as many as you want and make your own palettes up using the paints as I've done with these little tubes. Now, I'm going to show you here a basic set of colours that I advise. There's quite a lot of colours there. But to this sheet I would add turquoise as a very important colour now, especially in watercolour that I use a lot. I use turquoise in nearly all my paints now. You can make a turquoise, you can use viridian, you can use a little bit of cerulean with it, you can use viridian and a touch of lemon yellow or cerulean and a touch of lemon yellow, but to make a really good turquoise, better that it's already done. And of course another useful colour is the cobalt violet. So if I'm going to say buy a basic set of colours beyond these, then here's my list. I would advise you to add turquoise to it and also the cobalt violet, but there's 10 base colours that will do everything you want to do. There are other colours such as bright red and so on, which are even brighter than the cadmium red. There are other beautiful colours on the market which will do many other things that you might want to do, that you might want to explore and experiment with. Fine, but here's a basic set of colours, and remember, art is quality only. Okay, next then, you've got to decide whether you're going to buy the little boxes or whether you're going to get your own tubes. That's totally up to you. You can buy the colours separately to put into the boxes, but I prefer to use the tubes and make my own boxes up. Right, on to brushes now then. Again, I only want to advise you to get a few brushes just to give you the basics. So here's my 2 sets of brushes. And I've got lots of watercolour brushes, more watercolour brushes than I have acrylics or oils. The reason being that there are more effects that I tend to use. And I use other effects with the oils and other brushes and sponges and fingers and all sorts of other ways of working, rollers and everything. As you've seen recently, I've been exploring with the sponge rollers too, so I like to keep those in. But all you're going to need is 2 brushes. You can get away with just 2 brushes. We could get away, as Ron Ransom does, with a hake, a 1-inch hake and a rigger. We can get away with an oval mop and a round and a rigger, or just a rigger, and then you can build up from there depending on what effects you want. I would have, say, 3 different sizes of round, working up from very small to a medium, a number 2, a number 7, a number 10, something like that. An oval mop is still good to have, so I would have those 4 brushes and a rigger. Then you decide if you want to move on to having any flats or stiffer brushes and so on. I've got other films here showing you how to use all of those brushes. We will be using some in this film. I will be demonstrating shortly how to get different effects with the various brushes as the film becomes more advanced. We're doing it in 3 parts. So what I'm doing at the moment is saying, here are your basics, but you can be more advanced and buy these other brushes if you wish as you go on. All I'm doing is giving you the foundation. So what are you going to mix in? You're going to need a plate or a palette to mix in. You're going to need a jar to put your water in. I usually use a screw top jar if I'm travelling. An ordinary big carrier bag is quite good because you can carry all the work in that. How would you work? An easel or a board, or the cheapest way is just a piece of ordinary MDF drawing board. Then you can work up to pieces of plywood and so on. You can get wonderful easels, little wooden ones. You can get easels to sit down on. Again, all of my other films go into that, but don't need to deal with that. All I'm doing now, again, basics on watercolour. Right, with those other mediums, what else might you want to use? You might want some masking fluid. You might want to use either these little bottles, where you can put them on with a very fine nozzle, or you might want to use a clay shaper with a rubber tip to put it on from a jar. I prefer the blue masking fluid so I can see what I'm doing on white paper, but white masking fluid is fine. I'll discuss with you what we're going to do with that. Are there other mediums you can use with watercolour? Yes, we can use pastels, we've seen that. We can use soft pastel with water, and acrylic inks too. Beautiful colours, much stronger, very vibrant, and I will show you examples of this at the end of one of these films, where I show you various examples of my work again that I haven't shown you before, so you see fresh work every time, and different ways of working with watercolour or mixed medium. There's pen and ink, for instance. So we've got brushes, we've got sponges, we've got the Profi pens for pen and ink, and we've got China graph pencils and so on that we can do mixed media with the watercolour as well. Again, you choose what you want, but just the basics for the moment. Just those few brushes will do you. Obviously a pencil to work with, a nice soft pencil. A 3B or 4B, so that it rubs off very easily and gently. Don't press too hard when you're working, otherwise you disturb the surface of the paper. If you start rubbing it with a rubber, you disturb the surface of the paper, you disturb that glue size, and the paint won't go on as well. So you have to be a bit more careful on this. So a soft rubber as well. You buy expensive brushes or soft brushes. Well, the artificial hair on the brushes now are so good. I think that one can, generally speaking, one can buy an artificial hairbrush now that will be as good as many of the old sables and so on. Mixed hair are quite good too, but there are very good brushes on the market that are very reasonably priced. Again, it's what you want to use them for. I've told you the basic of the brushes you need to get. A floppy brush will be a mop, a soft brush to get the water on and across the painting, a stiffer brush for doing more detail, a fine brush for doing fine lines, and so on. And probably a stiffer brush for doing dry brush work as well. Anyway, again, something I'm going to go into showing you later. But there's the basics. So let's say now you've bought all your stuff, you're all set up. That's the first part of the video finished. We know what watercolour is, we know how it's made, we know what it can do, we know the basics of what it can do now, and we know the basic techniques. What we need to do now is move on to looking at each of those photographs I showed you earlier, and I will do a study of each and every one of them using all of these different techniques, using various brushes, and just showing you what you'll be able to play with and experiment, and the great fun you can have with watercolour, all these wonderful things we can do with this medium that can't be done as easily with other mediums. And this is why we do it. We should use each medium for the subject, for the purpose, for the feeling, the atmosphere, the light we want to get.